Well, hey everybody, I'm here in beautiful, I was gonna say sunny Clearwater Beach, but it's not so sunny right now. But you know what? Any day at the beach is a good day, right? So this video's got a couple of takeaways from it. Number one, at the end, there's gonna be a photo I took at sunset the other night, and I'll go in and I'll do a quick edit on that photo toward the end there. But I want to get to a little bit about how I took that photo and how and why I took that photo, because I think there's an interesting little story and takeaway from this. So this past week, Sony released a 35mm f1.8. Nice, right here. Nice light lens. You've got that shallow aperture you can get with that 1.8, and sharp lens, great with distortion and everything like that. And last week they had sent me a message and asked if I would take the lens out for a spin before it got released, just to try it out, get some thoughts on it, and get some photos to share and whatnot. So I did just that, and it was at the beach where I am right now, apparently. So I did just that, and this is gonna sound like it's a story about the lens, and it's really not. What I'm hoping you take away from this is a little bit of a bigger picture than that. So I'm mostly a landscape and wildlife photographer, and when it comes to being outdoors, I'm almost always shooting at f/16. I'm almost always trying to get the most front to back depth of field, the largest depth of field in the photo. So I'm almost always shooting at f/16 trying to do that. And I got this lens and I started thinking, I'm not gonna take this lens out and just go shoot landscapes the way that I always do and shoot them at f/16, because it's kind of pointless. Like, why have a lens like that? I think you get these low f-stop number, these shallow depth of field lenses. I think you get them so that you can really take them out and work them at 1.8 or 2.8 or 1.4, whatever the lens happens to be. So I kind of made it my mission that I was gonna go out and shoot this lens at f1.8. All right, I was going to still shoot landscapes. I was still going to incorporate my style of outdoor photography, but take a different spin on it, that with a shallow depth of field like this, we can take a big scene and we can showcase what we want out of this scene without any photo editing, without any post-processing, but by just shooting at f1.8 and focusing on a certain part of the photo. For example, I was at the pier that's down the beach the other night, and I had two things I could shoot with it because there was a little tide pool that reflected in front of it. So in one shot, I focused on the pier, but I got down low so that I've got my foreground, I've got the beach and the water, but at f1.8, if I'm focused on the pier, all that's going to be very, very blurry, and that tells a story. That blur, it's like our eyes. Our eyes don't, if we're looking at something close, they're not focused on something far away. If we're looking at something far away, they're not focused on something close. So our eyes would do the same thing. And by getting down low and by blurring everything in the foreground, it tells a story, and it really focuses your attention on that pier, where at a different aperture, maybe your attention gets focused somewhere else. And then you can do the same thing in reverse, where I focus on the water or the beach in front of me, and whatever's off in the distance, again, at f1.8 is going to get very, very blurry, and that tells a different story. So I hope, my takeaway from this, I'm hoping you kind of get that it's not about a 35 1.8, okay? You can do this with any wide angle lens, and if you have a 2.8 or an f4 lens, you will get plenty depth of field, or I should say lack of depth of field. You'll get plenty of shallow depth of fieldness with that lens. So don't make it about the lens and the fact that you may or may not have a 1.8 lens. It has nothing to do with that. You'll get very shallow depth of field. But to me, the takeaway is, next time you're out, you don't have to change the way you shoot. I'm not saying become a landscape photographer that only shoots at f2.8 or 1.8 or whatever and just focuses on small details. I'm saying put this into your little bag of tricks. Like, when you're out shooting and you've exhausted what you think are the compositions that are out there, start to think, what happens if I change my aperture? What happens if I go and I find something in the foreground that I blur, that I lead to a sharp background, or vice versa? And I think it'll be a great exercise, and I think you'll come away with some really unique photos from it. Okay? Now, I did promise you the editing video, so that will follow. And of course, if you want to find out more about the Sony lens, I'll make sure there's links in the description and all that fun stuff. All right, well let's dive into the computer part of this, and I'll share a couple of quick photos that I took with the lens just to give you my thoughts on different ways to shoot it. I thought this was a nice way to have, again, incorporate a wider type of a scene. There's a lot in this, but again, focusing on using that shallow depth of field. Same thing here. Because it's a 35mm, we're able to incorporate a little bit more. I don't care for the next three. I was practicing a little bit. You will never ever see these again. Nice simple scene, not necessarily even affected by depth of field at all in this one. The sun did come out for a little while, and I thought the contrast of the blues and the yellows in this, especially because it's focused up close in the foreground and those clouds start to get blurry back there. Little lifeguard tower. This one doesn't necessarily have anything that shooting at a shallow depth of field would give you. That was before I removed everything. Same thing with this one. Now this one, on the other hand, you could see I focused on the lifeguard tower here and everything by incorporating foreground. And that's the key, is, a photo like this doesn't have any foreground really. By the time you got that lifeguard tower and even what's here in the distance, the camera is not going to necessarily blur one or the other dramatically, depending on what you're focused on. But when you've got something right up in front of the camera, now you'll get a lot of that blur. You can really change the story that you start to tell here. As I got closer to the pier, this is the shot that we're going to work on here. This was one of the ones under the pier. I focused on the pier itself over here, so everything gets blurry. This one I focused right up close and everything back there got blurry. This is too much for me. F1.8 only leaves that little sliver of focus here. So if I did do this, and I don't necessarily mind if there was a shell or something, a sand dollar here, but I would probably shoot it at like 2.8 or f4 to give a little bit more of a plane of focus inside of there. And then the opposite here, I focused up close and let that pier go off in the distance. Okay, let's go back and work on this photo here. And you could see what I'm starting with, just kind of blah sky, blah clouds. So some of the first things I did, I just crank up the shadows just to open up some of that dark area there. Pull back on the highlights just to pull back on some of the brighter spots in the sky. I'm going to grab my crop tool and just rotate around a little bit just to straighten that horizon. From here, sometimes I option or alt click on whites and blacks. Drag that till I see a white point. Again, just option or alt click and the screen will go black. Drag it till you see a white point. Same thing on the black side. The black point, and that's just going to give me contrast. And you could do the same thing with the contrast slider. I just personally like whites and blacks. A little bit of texture, just give a little bit more to the clouds and the pier back here. As far as the main settings, I really wouldn't do too much more to it. So to me, the magic in this photo, and before we get there, let's take care of using the spot healing brush to clone out those kids in the foreground there. And don't forget their reflection there. So that's, sometimes we have to use Photoshop, but in this case, I think it worked out really well to just do it in here. Lightroom, there was a lot of texture that was similar around. Just going to make sure that horizon line is still straight. But that was a pretty easy job for Lightroom. So for me, the color came from the graduated filter. Okay, I went in here and I crank up the tint toward magenta and the temperature toward yellow. And I went down here and I just dragged down a graduated filter over the sky. What you can see is that it's taking, if I turn it off, you can see it's just giving me a little bit of color, a little bit of some of those pinks and purples that sometimes we see at sunset, a little bit of yellow, and it's just giving me some color versus just the blah gray. Right? Now, the other thing that I did is once I did it once, I decided it wasn't enough, so I went here and I dragged all the way down at the bottom and I just spread it out a little bit more, and I did another one, and I think it's too much, so we can pull those back each side there. But the other thing that we can do is we can reset those and we can attack color a different way by going down here to the color swatch. We can click on that color swatch And again, we're working with the reds and the oranges and, you know, along those lines here. So I can go in here and start to work with color in a different way. And that'll infuse some color, again, into a very blah scene in a very different way here. I'm going to definitely back off. And I know there's somebody watching this that's saying, I like the before better and I don't like to add color to this. Then don't do it. This is me, and I love to put color back, especially when the light and the sunset did not cooperate. So by all means, don't feel like this is a rule and you have to follow it. But I think those two things really dramatically help work with the color in a different way. That's before and that's after the graduated filter. Another thing that I do sometimes here is I'll crank up on the saturation. You got to be careful because your grays will start to get purple and blue, so you don't want to go too far with it. But that'll, again, push a little bit of color back. Wherever there was color, and there was some of it back here, that'll push a little bit more of it back in. I would finish things off with a slight vignette. So, just to bring our focus in toward the center of the frame here. And then crop-wise, I mean, I think we're pretty good on the crop. I might pull back a little bit on the sky. And that way I'm just giving 2/3 weight to the foreground, 1/3 weight to the sky. And that, I think, you know, compositionally, I think that works a little bit better. Okay, so folks, I hope that just gives you something to think about, you know, in the camera side of things, you know, what maybe shooting at some different apertures that you're not used to and the effects that doing something like that can help. And then also on the photo editing side, if you have something where the weather doesn't quite cooperate, we have some ways that we can go in there. As you can see here, that's the total before, that's the total after. We have some ways that we can go in there and still make a nice photo out of it. Come back, umbrella, come back.